Hank doesn't bark like that unless something's wrong. The sound ripped through the trees like a warning flare. Not playful, not curious, urgent. A kind of alarm that didn't give room for second guesses. Elliot Granger froze mid-step, his boot sinking slightly into the wet Appalachian soil. The trail ahead twisted into the fog, thick enough to blur the outlines of the pines that crowded both sides. The storm from the night before had left the whole forest soaked and shivering. Branches sagged under the weight of leftover rain, and the air smelled of wet bark, overturned earth, and something metallic he couldn't place. Hank stood 20 yards ahead, tail stiff body leaning forward, ears locked on something past the bend. His growl rolled low and steady like a warning he was ready to escalate. Hank Elliott called out, but his voice dissolved into the fog. No reaction. He should have turned back. Anyone else would have. But something gnawed at him, something that had been gnawing since the day he packed what little he owned and drove up these mountains to start over. He didn't have much left, just this cabin, the quiet, and Hank. They were the only constant he had after life cracked clean in half. He moved forward, careful on the muddy slope. The rainfall had carved thin streams along the trail, water trickling like whispers. Every few steps his foot sank deeper than expected, as if the ground itself was loosening. "Hank, easy," he murmured. The dog didn't ease. Elliot rounded the bend, breath caught halfway up his throat. Down a shallow slope, partially revealed by a landslide of wet earth, was the outline of something impossible. A structure. No more like the remains of one. A sunken frame. A slanted doorway. Wood darkened almost black by age and rain. Thick roots curled around it like the forest had been trying to swallow the whole thing for decades. Elliot blinked hard. He knew every inch of this trail. He'd hiked it since he was a boy, long before he came back to Tennessee to escape the life he'd once thought he wanted. But this was new. Or rather, it wasn't new. It just hadn't wanted to be seen before now. Hank barked again, sharper this time, and Elliot felt a cold weight settle in his gut. He slipped carefully down the slope, gripping roots and branches for balance. The soil slid under his boots as he approached the half-buried door. Up close, the wood looked ancient, splintered, swollen, scarred. Moss coated the bottom edge like a blanket pulled over a secret. A hinge dangled uselessly from one corner. He crouched, ran his fingers along the rough wood, and felt the faint indentation where a handle once sat. The air around the doorway was unnaturally cool, almost cold, as if the inside had been sealed off from the world for far longer than made sense. He hesitated, then pushed. The door didn't creak open. It sighed, a long, tired exhale, as if something inside had been holding its breath. Elliot leaned back instinctively, heart thudding. Hank whimpered at the top of the slope. He pulled out his phone not for light, just for reassurance, and angled the beam into the darkness. The room was small. Stone walls. A sagging wooden table. A cold fire pit, half buried in ash. Dust hung in the air like suspended time. But what caught his eye wasn't the furniture. It was the wall. Dozens of scratches. Thin, deliberate. Grouped in rows of 5. Days. Someone had marked their days. A chill ran up Elliot's spine so fast he had to steady himself on the doorway. He swallowed, but his throat felt tight like the air itself had thickened. Someone lived here. Someone counted time here. Someone waited for something that maybe never came. He stepped 1 foot inside. The air felt heavier, colder. Every part of him said, "Don't go further, not yet." He wasn't ready for whatever waited in the shadows. So he backed out slowly, refusing to turn his back to the room, until he stepped into the daylight again. Hank whined, pacing at the top of the hill like he wanted to leave right now. Elliot glanced up toward him. "Easy, boy." His voice was quiet, almost swallowed by the forest. He looked back at the door, half buried, half forgotten, revealed only because the storm had peeled back its camouflage of earth and roots. What if the storm hadn't come? What if Hank hadn't barked? Would this place have stayed buried forever? He climbed back up the slope, boots slipping on the slick earth, and when he reached Hank, the dog pushed his head against Elliot's knee, trembling. "I know," Elliot whispered, rubbing the dog's neck. "I know. There's something off about it." The fog around them pushed and drifted like it was holding its own secrets. Elliot looked back one more time. The doorway yawned like a mouth that had finally been allowed to speak. He didn't know whose story had been left there. Didn't know why someone had carved days onto cold stone walls. But he knew one thing with a certainty he hadn't felt in months. He had to go back. He had to see more. And the strange heaviness in his chest told him that whatever he'd stepped into wasn't something he could walk away from. As he and Hank headed back toward the trail, the forest seemed to shift around them. A breeze skittered along the branches overhead, carrying the scent of old smoke and damp stone. Elliot swallowed hard. "Who lived there?" he murmured to himself. The forest didn't answer. But the question followed him all the way home, pressing against him like a weight he couldn't set down. And as the sky darkened and the woods settled into their nighttime hush, Elliot realized something unsettling. Finding that shelter hadn't been an accident. It felt intentional, like the past had just tapped him on the shoulder. And it wasn't done. Elliot goes home unable to sleep, replaying the scratches on the wall and the suffocating stillness inside the shelter. Curiosity becomes obsession, and by morning he decides he has to return because he can feel something is buried there, something more than just a forgotten room. He couldn't stop thinking about the marks. They weren't random scratches or graffiti. They had rhythm, intent. Grouped in fives, 4 vertical lines and a diagonal slash through them. Dozens of clusters, one after another, etched low on the back wall. Not high like decoration, but close to the ground, like someone had been sitting when they made them. Counting. The image stayed with Elliot all night. He'd sat at his kitchen table with a mug of black coffee gone cold, staring out the window into the trees. The woods didn't feel the same anymore. It wasn't just that he'd found something hidden. It was that the place felt like it had been waiting to be found. That storm hadn't destroyed the hillside. It had peeled it back, like revealing a scar beneath skin. Hank had refused to sleep in the usual spot by the back door. He'd curled up under the kitchen table, nose pressed to Elliot's boot. Every now and then he let out a low whimper, as if something still unsettled him too. The next morning, Elliot packed a flashlight, gloves, and an old Army surplus field journal he used for sketches and notes. He hadn't told anyone what he found. Not that he had many people to tell. But even if he did, he couldn't explain it yet, not without sounding crazy or obsessed. Still, something in his gut told him there was more. The marks on the wall were only part of the story. By noon, he was standing at the edge of the slope again. The forest was quiet today. Not peaceful quiet. Too quiet. Even the birds were still. Hank hesitated at the edge but didn't bark this time. Just watched Elliot as he made his way down. The door looked even darker now, shadowed by the sun overhead. Elliot pulled it open again, and that same breathless sigh met him. He clicked on the flashlight and stepped inside. Dust danced in the beam. The stone walls were damp but solid, cold to the touch. The room smelled like wet earth and memory. He moved straight to the scratches. There had to be at least 100. No names, no symbols, just those tallies. A record of time or maybe survival. He ran his fingers over a few of them, rough, uneven, deep enough to have taken effort. Someone had carved these slowly, maybe even with their fingernails, if they'd had nothing else. "Who were you?" he whispered. Then he noticed something else. Near the marks, one of the stones in the wall looked newer. Not clean, but less eroded than the others. It wasn't flush, it jutted slightly. Elliot pressed on it. It didn't move. He tried pulling. Nothing. Then he remembered what his grandfather once said about these old shelters. If they didn't want you to find it, they'd hide it behind what you'd never think to move. Elliot turned his attention to the floor. The boards were warped and covered in dust and moss, but one near the corner had a different sound when tapped. Hollow. He knelt, wedged his fingers beneath it, and pulled. The board groaned but lifted. Beneath it, a small cavity protected from moisture by a lining of old oilcloth. Inside was a metal box, rusted but intact, rectangular with a dent in one corner, and the kind of latch that looked like it hadn't been opened in decades. Elliot's breath caught in his throat. He lifted it carefully, brought it into the light, and opened it. Inside were letters, dozens of them folded with care. A black and white photo of a family, a man in overalls, a woman in a floral dress, and a little girl no older than 5. A thin wooden locket. And at the bottom, a small note on yellowing paper, edges brittle. "If someone finds this, give it to her. She's still alive." He sat back on his heels, heart pounding. Alive. The letters were handwritten, the ink faded but legible. The first one began, "To James. If you're still out there." The handwriting was delicate. A woman's hand. The voice on the page trembled with emotion even decades later. She talked about hiding, about waiting, about the fire, the shelter, the hope that he would come for them, about their daughter Clara. Elliot felt like he'd cracked open someone's memory and slipped into it. Page after page, the story unfolded not as a narrative but as a cry into silence. Letters written every week, maybe every day, by someone trying to hold on to their sanity. Someone trying to make sure their little girl didn't grow up without knowing who she was. The last letter ended abruptly. No signature. Just a final line. "We're leaving. I can't wait anymore. If you find this, forgive me." Elliot wiped his hand across his face. It came away streaked with dirt and dust and something heavier. He looked at the photo again. The girl, Clara. She'd be in her 70s now, maybe older. If she was still alive. If she'd survived leaving the shelter. If she hadn't been buried by time like the house nearly was. The thought settled deep in Elliot's chest. He couldn't just walk away from this. Couldn't pretend he hadn't read those words or seen the photo. Whoever Martha Benton was, whoever Clara had become, they weren't names in a book. They were real. And they had trusted the wrong place to keep their secrets safe. "These aren't just marks," Elliot whispered, staring at the wall again. Someone was counting. Days. The line echoed in the space around him. Not just how long they were down here, maybe how long they had left. He gently folded the letters back into the box, closed the lid, and stood. The next step was clear. He had to find out what happened to Clara, where she went, if she ever found her father, if she was even alive, and if she wasn't, he'd make sure someone still remembered her. He stepped back out into the daylight, squinting as the sun pierced through the clouds. Hank was lying in the grass, eyes on him, tail wagging just once. Elliot gave the dog a scratch behind the ear. "Come on, boy. We've got someone to find." As they walked away, the forest didn't feel as heavy. Still quiet, but different, like it had exhaled something, or maybe passed the weight onto him. And as they reached the trailhead, Elliot thought of the names on the letters. Martha, Clara, James. Buried history. But not forgotten. Not anymore. Tomorrow he'd visit Ruby. If anyone knew how to trace a lost name through Smoky Mountain history, it was her. And something told Elliot this story was just beginning. These mountains don't forget, son. They just wait till someone's ready to remember. That's what Ruby Maynard said when Elliot laid the photo down on the counter between them. Her bookstore smelled like time. Faded pages, old ink, tobacco, wood polish. The kind of scent that wrapped around you and whispered stories before a word was even spoken. Ruby herself looked like someone born into the hills and carved from them late 70s hair, like silver wire eyes sharp as a blade's edge. She stared at the photo in silence for a long while, one hand resting near a coffee mug stained darker than the wood. Elliot said nothing. He knew better than to interrupt. Finally, Ruby reached out and tapped the corner of the picture, the man in overalls, the woman in the flower dress, the little girl sitting between them. "James and Martha Benton," she said. "That there's Clara. Lord Almighty, I haven't seen their faces in nearly 70 years. Elliot exhaled slowly. "You're sure I'd bet this whole store on it," Ruby said, leaning back. "They were decent folk. Lived up past the northern ridge, close to the old mining roads. James worked coal. Hard worker, good heart. Martha stayed home with Clara. People around here thought the world of 'em. So what happened?" Ruby's face darkened. "They vanished. Same year the North Mine collapsed, 1953. Everyone remembers that. Some say it was sabotage, some say bad wiring. Either way, a dozen men were lost. James was one of them. But he didn't die in the mine," Elliot said. "According to the letters, Martha and Clara hid out in a shelter. He was supposed to meet them." Ruby nodded. "I remember whispers of that. Said the Bentons had enemies. That someone set fire to their house not long before the cave-in. Folks thought Martha and Clara died in it. They didn't." "No, they didn't." Ruby agreed. But no one knew. Everyone just assumed. And once people assume, they stop looking. Elliot tapped the notebook he'd brought with him, already filled with observations, locations, details. "I found the shelter buried near the trail past Cold Creek. It's not on any map. Covered by the hillside until the storm." Ruby looked at him, then slowly smiled. "Well now, looks like the mountains weren't done with that story after all." She walked to a tall shelf near the back and pulled down a thin, leather-bound record book. "This ain't public, and it sure as hell ain't online. Family Register. Handwritten by Reverend Josiah Carter. He's the only one still alive from that time, still preaching over at St. Luke's. If anyone knows what happened after the shelter, he does." Elliot took the book with care, flipping through its pages. Names, dates, marriages, deaths. Lives scribbled in ink that barely held together after all these years. He paused at a line that read, "Benton Clara, moved to Shelter Septimon, 1953. Then next to it, transferred, unknown relative. Oct 1953. No address. No last name. Just gone." He looked up. "So someone took her in, that's what it says. Reverend would know who or where." Ruby leaned on the counter again, folding her arms. "But before you go running off, tell me something. Why you chasing this story, Elliot?" He hesitated. The truth felt too big and too close to say out loud. Because someone wanted Clara to be found, he finally said. Because someone believed her story mattered enough to hide it safely for decades. And because now that I've opened that door, I can't unsee what's inside. Ruby studied him for a moment. Then she nodded once, slow and solid. Then you do it right. You go to the Reverend, and you listen. St. Luke's sat like a ghost on a hillside 20 minutes from town. The white clapboard church hadn't changed in 70 years. The bell tower leaned a little to the left, but it still rang every Sunday. Reverend Josiah Carter looked like he'd outlasted half the buildings in the county. His back was crooked, his voice steady. He invited Elliot into his office without question. When Elliot showed him the photo, the Reverend took it with both hands as if it were something sacred. Lord, he whispered, that child, Clara Benton. You knew her briefly. I ran the shelter back then. She and her mother stayed with us for almost a month. Martha was terrified, kept looking over her shoulder. Said she didn't trust the men James had been working for. Why, she never said it plain. Just hinted that James had tried to do the right thing, and someone made him disappear for it. Reverend Carter placed the photo down gently. One day she packed up Clara and vanished. Said she had a relative willing to take them in. She didn't leave a name. I wasn't in a position to stop her. Folks moved on real quiet back then. Elliot nodded. I think Clara's still alive. I just need a lead. The Reverend pulled out an old yellowed envelope. I don't keep many things, but this I kept. It's the intake form Martha filled out when she came to the shelter. Had her brother's name listed under emergency contact. He handed it to Elliot. Written in faded ink. Lawrence Brooks, Oak Ridge, Tennessee. Elliot's heart jumped. Thank you. Reverend Carter smiled softly. Truth finds a way, Mr. Granger. You just have to be patient enough to listen when it whispers. Back at his cabin, Elliot stared at the map of Tennessee spread out on his table. Oak Ridge wasn't far. An hour, maybe two, depending on the back roads. He looked at the photo again. Martha's kind eyes, James's strong shoulders, Clara's small, open smile. Somewhere out there, that little girl had grown old, had carried these memories or buried them. He had to know which. Hank sat by the door tail, thumping once as if sensing the decision. Elliot folded the photo, placed it carefully in his bag, and reached for his keys. Tomorrow he'd drive to Oak Ridge. He'd knock on every door if he had to, because the girl in the photo wasn't just a name on a record anymore. She was real, and she deserved to know someone finally remembered her. Elliot heads to Oak Ridge in search of Clara. But as the past begins to open itself up, he realizes some people never wanted this story brought back to light. And that silence in some corners of this town is still sacred. We all have ghosts in these woods. Most just don't come with a return address. Elliot stood on the steps of St. Luke's shelter. For the second time in 2 days, the morning sun doing its best to burn off the mountain fog. His boots scraped against the warped boards as he raised a hand to knock on the screen door. This time he wasn't here to ask about history. He was here to trace the rest of Clara's story. Reverend Carter greeted him with a knowing look, his hand resting on the frame like he'd been expecting the knock. You found the name, the old man said. Lawrence Brooks. I drove to Oak Ridge yesterday, but there's no record of him past 1979. No obituary, no property deeds, nothing. Carter motioned him inside. Then you're looking in the wrong place. Records are for the living, but memories, they're where the truth hides. The shelter's interior hadn't changed much since the 50s. Old bunk beds lined the back wall. A crucifix hung above a cracked window. A coffee pot hissed quietly in the corner. The place wasn't just a shelter, it was a time capsule. Elliot followed the Reverend into his office. "I found Clara's intake form," Elliot said, setting it on the desk. It listed Brooks as her uncle, but no last known address. "I asked around town, most people barely remember him, and the ones who do don't say much." Reverend Carter rubbed his chin. Lawrence kept to himself. Had a cabin north of Oak Ridge, deeper in the brush. Off the grid, before off the grid was fashionable. When Martha came through, she trusted him enough to send Clara there. "But why disappear?" Elliot asked. "Why not come back once it was safe, because safe is never what it seems to be?" Carter said, his voice low. "Especially in towns like ours. Back then, a woman running with a child and no husband had nowhere to go but silence." Elliot nodded slowly. "And silence gets passed down." Carter stood and walked to a file cabinet that looked like it hadn't been opened in a decade. He dug through folders before pulling out a yellow envelope. "Back in 1982, I received this from Lawrence. Said to hold on to it in case someone ever came asking. I never thought anyone would." Elliot took the envelope with careful hands. Inside were two things, a letter and a ledger. The letter was from Lawrence Brooks, addressed to Reverend Carter. He wrote about taking in Clara, about changing her name to protect her, and about raising her on a quiet stretch of land near Norris Lake. He called her a storm survivor, said she never talked much about her mother after the first year. But she thrived. Went to school under a new name. Got her GED. Learned to grow things from the land. The ledger was a list of dates, most of them appointments, dentists, school meetings, bills paid. But the last page was different. A single name stood out. Clara May Banks. A phone number. A mailing address. Elliot stared at the paper as his pulse quickened. "She's alive," he whispered. "Looks like it." Carter said. Elliot ran a hand through his hair, the weight of the discovery finally landing. "Do you think she knows any of this?" he asked. "That there's still a piece of her past out there, maybe? Or maybe she's spent her whole life trying not to?" Elliot folded the paper and slipped it into his notebook. "I have to talk to her. I figured you would." Reverend Carter followed Elliot back to the front steps. The fog had lifted, now replaced by sunlight and the hum of late summer insects. Elliot paused, hand on the railing. "What if she tells me to leave it alone?" he asked. The Reverend gave a quiet chuckle. "Then you thank her for her time and keep walking. But something tells me you're not the first ghost she's had to face." The house was a one-story ranch-style pale green siding with white shutters tucked between a post office and a gas station on the edge of Oak Ridge. It was modest, neat, with flower beds lining the porch and wind chimes whispering in the breeze. Elliot stood on the sidewalk for a good minute before he moved. Hank sat in the truck watching him through the window, like he was waiting for a signal. He stepped up to the door and knocked. Nothing. He waited, then knocked again, 3 soft raps steady. A curtain shifted. Then the door opened. A woman in her early 70s stood in the doorway. Clara May Banks. Her silver hair was tied back in a braid. Her eyes, sharp, steady, familiar, narrowed slightly when she looked at him. "Yes." Elliot hesitated. "I think I found something that belongs to you." He reached into his bag and pulled out the photo. Her gaze dropped to it. She didn't reach for it, didn't speak, just stared. Then her knees softened and she gripped the doorframe. "That can't be." "It is," Elliot said quietly. "I found it in a shelter in the hills. I think your mother left it behind." For a long moment, Clara said nothing. The wind moved the chimes above her. Then she stepped aside. Come in. She sat on the edge of a worn love seat, the photo resting on her lap. Elliot took the chair across from her arms, resting on his knees, his voice soft as he explained everything, how he'd found the shelter after the storm, the scratched wall, the box beneath the floor, the letters, the names, the trail that led him here. Clara didn't cry. She didn't tremble. But her silence was loud. I thought that part of my life was buried, she finally said. But here you are, holding it in your hands. Do you remember the shelter pieces, she said. I was 5, maybe 6. My mother used to count the days aloud while she marked them on the wall. We waited for my father, but he never came. Your mother wrote letters to him. She left them behind, hoping someone would find them. I never knew, Clara whispered. She never told me she'd been writing. She wrote until the day you left. Clara stared at the photo. She said we were going to start over, that we'd never speak of it again. I think it broke her. Waiting. She protected you. She did, Clara nodded. And she carried the weight of it until the day she died. Elliot leaned forward. Would you want to go back to see it again? Clara looked up at him, her eyes older now, wiser, wounded. I'm not going to see a house, she said. I'm going to see what's left of him. The next morning, Clara joins Elliot and Hank for a trip back into the forest. But what she finds waiting inside the shelter is more than old stone and shadows. It's the echo of a man's love and a memory too strong to stay buried. I don't remember the walls, but I remember the silence. They arrived just after sunrise. The trail was still slick from the night's dew, and the sky wore the same soft gray it always did in early fall, when the leaves hadn't fully turned, but the cold had started to whisper. Elliot helped Clara out of the truck as Hank leapt down beside them, tail wagging, but alert. The shelter was only a 10-minute hike from here, but it felt heavier this time, denser, like the woods had taken a breath and were holding it, waiting to see what Clara would do. She looked up at the canopy, then down the narrow trail where the mist still lingered in patches. This smells like her, she said quietly, like my mother's coat after a storm. Wet pine and wood smoke. Elliot nodded, not wanting to interrupt whatever thread of memory she was pulling. She walked slowly, not because of her age, but like she was reading the forest one tree at a time. They reached the slope a few minutes later. The door was just as Elliot had left it, weather-beaten and slightly ajar, the darkness behind it, like a breath held for too long. Clara stopped at the top of the hill, staring down. I've dreamed about this place, she said. But in my dreams, it's never still. It's always shaking. You don't have to go in, Elliot said. She glanced at him. I didn't come all this way to stop at the door. She took the descent carefully, steady on her feet, her hand brushing along the bark and vines as she moved. Elliot followed closely. Hank stayed at the ridge, ears twitching. Clara reached the doorway and paused. Her breath caught, whether from the chill or the memory, Elliot wasn't sure. She reached out and touched the edge of the frame. Then she stepped inside. The air changed. Not colder, but tighter, denser. Elliot followed, flashlight in hand, though Clara didn't seem to need it. She moved with a strange sort of ease, like she'd practiced this in her mind for years. Her fingers traced the stone wall where the tallies were carved. She knelt. These were hers, she said. I can feel it. I remember the sound, scrape, 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 every morning, no matter what. She was counting the days, Elliot said. Clara nodded, and trying to hold on to them. She turned and walked to the far side of the room near the sunken corner where the oilcloth had been. She crouched again and rested her hand flat on the floor. She used to sit here, rock back and forth, hum songs I never knew the names of. I thought she was trying to keep me calm, but now I wonder if she was keeping herself from breaking. Elliot knelt beside her. She wrote letters, dozens, all to your father. Clara closed her eyes. I haven't said his name in over 50 years. James. He was supposed to meet us here. But he didn't. He may never have had the chance. The fire the mine collapsed, someone tried to erase your family. I know, Clara said, but she believed he was still out there, even when everything else had gone quiet. She stood, moved toward the table in the corner, and picked up a rusted tin cup still sitting on the surface. She turned it in her hands, and for a second, it looked like it belonged there, like she belonged there. I don't remember the walls, she said again, softer this time. But I remember the silence. Elliot watched her, unsure whether to speak or stay quiet. Clara filled the room like light through a crack, slow but unstoppable. He finally said, I think there's more to find. I think this place held more than just hiding. Clara turned to him. What do you mean? He hesitated. The way the walls are shaped. The way the floor dips slightly here, but not evenly. It's not just erosion. It feels built that way. Clara tilted her head. You think there's something underneath, maybe, or behind. I didn't want to disturb anything until you saw it first. She looked around the room again slowly. Then she stepped to the far corner and pressed her hand against a section of stone. It's warmer here. Elliot came over, pressing his own hand beside hers. He knocked. Hollow. They exchanged a glance. Working together, they cleared the moss and loose dirt from the seams between the stones. Behind one was a narrow gap, barely an inch wide, but enough to catch a draft. Elliot wedged his fingers into the crevice and pulled. The stone shifted with a groan, revealing a small alcove hidden behind the wall. Inside, wrapped in a cracked leather satchel, was a notebook. Clara reached for it with shaking hands. She opened the cover and exhaled sharply. It was James's handwriting. Dear Martha, the first page read, If you find this, it means I didn't make it back to you in time. She read in silence, lips moving slightly as she traced the words with her fingers. Elliot didn't interrupt. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing into the room like a heartbeat. James had made it to the shelter, just not while they were still there. His journal told the story, how he'd survived the mine collapse, how he'd escaped and gone into hiding, how he feared for Martha and Clara's lives, how he waited until it was safe and came looking. He never found them, but he came here, and he left this. He was alive, Clara said, voice cracking. He came for us. He didn't forget, Elliot said. Clara clutched the notebook to her chest and closed her eyes. All my life, I thought she was the one who waited, but now I know he was too. She leaned against the wall and let the tears fall quietly. Not ashamed, not broken, just released. Elliot stepped outside to give her space. Hank came to his side and leaned against him, solid and warm. From the shelter, Clara's voice drifted out, not words, just a soft hum, a tune long buried. The woods seemed to breathe again. And when she finally stepped out into the light, her face was different. Not younger, not less worn, but open. Like the part of her that had been holding its breath had finally exhaled. She looked at Elliot. I want to do something. Anything. I want to leave something here. For them, for us. So this place isn't just silence anymore. Clara and Elliot begin to restore the shelter, not just physically, but emotionally. They leave behind symbols of memory, grief, and healing. But in doing so, they uncover one final clue, a piece of evidence that suggests James's death wasn't an accident, and someone might have ensured he never made it out of those woods alive. I thought I came here to bury the past, but maybe the past was never buried at all. Clara's hands were covered in dirt, the good kind, the kind that stained your palms and stuck under your fingernails, but meant you were doing something that mattered. She knelt beside the shelter entrance, smoothing out the soil where they'd just planted a cluster of wildflowers, bloodroot, her mother's favorite. White petals, soft and delicate, standing in contrast to the coarse earth they grew from. She looked up at Elliot, who was setting a small handmade wooden marker into the ground nearby. He didn't speak, just offered a quiet nod once it was in place. It read simply, Martha and James Benton. Found, not forgotten. Behind them, the shelter now looked less like a wound in the hillside and more like a memory honored. Elliot had reinforced the doorway, cleared the moss from the frame, even replaced the broken hinge. Inside, they had swept out years of decay, leaving only the marks on the wall untouched. Clara had asked him to leave those. She said they were her mother's voice, a rhythm she wanted to keep. They'd spent the last 3 days working here, together. A quiet rhythm forming between them, coffee in the morning, tools in hand by mid-morning, conversations that filled the silences like song. Not all about the past, some about the present, some about what came next. It was Clara's idea to restore the shelter, to make it a place for memory, not mourning. But as they worked, Elliot had the gnawing sense that they were still missing something, that the shelter hadn't yet given up everything it held. And then earlier that morning he found it, a small metal clasp wedged between 2 floorboards. He'd pried it loose, thinking it was part of the old furniture. But when he pulled, a second board lifted with it, revealing a compartment not in the floor, but beneath the wall itself. A hollow space barely 6 inches deep, inside a cloth-wrapped bundle. He hadn't opened it yet. Not without Clara. Now standing together as the sunlight filtered through the trees, he reached into his satchel and handed her the bundle. She looked down at it for a long time before unfolding the cloth. Inside was a photograph, torn at the edges. It showed James younger than in the family photo, standing beside 2 other men. One wore a sheriff's badge. The other, unmistakably, was Vernon Croft. Clara's brow furrowed. That's the man my mother warned me about. Elliot nodded. Vernon Croft. Owned half the mining contracts back then. Ruthless businessman. No stranger to threats or cover-ups. Why would my father keep a photo of him? Elliot reached into the cloth again. This time he pulled out a small leather notebook, different from the one James had left behind in the alcove. This one was older, thicker, a ledger. He flipped through it. Pages filled with names, dates, numbers, payoffs, shipment records, and notes written in shorthand. Elliot didn't fully understand, but one phrase kept appearing in the margins, Hollow Ridge. Clara stared at it, then looked up sharply. That's not a place. It's a code. My father used to say it when he was trying to tell my mom something in front of strangers. It meant not safe. It was their signal. Elliot's heart dropped into his stomach. So these notes, they weren't just records. They were warnings. Clara nodded. He must have kept this hidden in case something happened to him, to expose whoever was involved. Elliot scanned the last few pages, and there it was. A line written in bold, all caps, if anything happens to me, look to Croft. He knows why. The words landed like a stone in Elliot's chest. Croft. The same Croft who dominated the region's coal politics for decades, who'd retired quietly to Knoxville 15 years ago, the man who was still very much alive. Clara's voice was tight. My father didn't just disappear. He was silenced. Elliot looked at her. And someone buried the truth with him. They sat in silence for a while, the woods closing gently around them. Hank padded up beside Clara and rested his head on her knee. She didn't seem to notice. After a long while, she said, "When I came here, I thought I'd just put it to rest. Say goodbye. But this," she held up the ledger, "this is something else. This is a door, and once it's open, you can't pretend you didn't see what's behind it." Elliot finished. She nodded. "So what do we do?" "We follow it," he said simply. "If your father tried to expose something, we owe it to him and your mother to finish it." Clara looked down at the photo again. Croft won't talk. Maybe not, Elliot agreed. But someone will. People like him never operate alone. There's always a second man. Someone who kept records. Someone who looked the other way. She looked up. "And you're willing to chase that?" He didn't hesitate. "You're not in this alone." Clara smiled faintly. "My mother would have liked you." They stood together and looked one last time at the shelter. It felt different now, less haunted, more whole. But Elliot knew they weren't done. They'd uncovered a truth that didn't want to stay buried. And the men who made sure it was buried had no idea it had just been dug up. As they packed their things, Elliot caught one last glimpse of the wildflowers they'd planted. Soft, beautiful, growing from a place meant to be forgotten. And behind him, in the place where her mother once counted each day, Clara whispered, "He came back for us. Now it's time we go back for him." Elliot and Clara head to Knoxville to confront Vernon Croft's legacy. But as they dig deeper, they find the old man's reach is longer than expected, and someone still wants this story kept quiet no matter what it takes. There's what's legal, and then there's what people get away with. Knoxville sprawled out like a city trying to forget its own shadow. Downtown gleamed with modernity, glass buildings, clean sidewalks, buzzing cafes. But beneath that shine, Elliot could feel the bones of something older, something less polished. It was in the brick alleys behind the old post office, in the abandoned mills on the south side, in the way some people lowered their voices when you asked the wrong questions. He and Clara had arrived early that morning, staying at a modest motel off Kingston Pike. No fanfare, no trail. Elliot wanted to stay quiet until they figured out who they could trust and who still answered to the Croft name. They started with public records, property deeds, corporate filings. Elliot was surprised at how deep Croft's roots went. Even in retirement, the man's name still floated on boards of directors, land trusts, and energy holdings. Every time they pulled a thread, it led back to another shell company or a family member managing inactive assets. Croft hadn't vanished. He'd multiplied. And according to a 2020 article buried in the Knoxville Journal's archives, Vernon Croft was still alive, 93 years old, living in a private estate outside the city, tucked behind gates and security. They wouldn't get to him easily. But Elliot wasn't convinced they needed to. He believed in second men, the ones who handled logistics, ran errands, disposed of messes. Croft would never get his own hands dirty. Someone else did that. So they looked for names in the ledger. And that's when they found him, Martin Elwell, a contractor listed several times beside coded entries. Hollow Ridge BLK-13 payout intake override. Elliot wasn't sure what most of it meant, but Elwell's name came up in the context of money changing hands, specifically right before the mine explosion in '53. Elliot dug further. Elwell had worked for a now-defunct mining firm, Baker & Sons Contracting. After the collapse, he moved into building inspection, then private security. He'd kept a low profile for decades, and then Elliot found an address, not in a city office, but on a gun permit renewal dated 3 years ago. He and Clara drove there just after sunset. The house sat at the edge of a wooded cul-de-sac, old brick, half the shutters missing, the porch light flickering. It didn't scream wealth. It screamed survival. The kind of place people retreat to when they've spent their lives looking over their shoulder. Elliot parked 2 houses down. "You sure you want to be here for this?" he asked Clara. She looked at the house like it owed her something. "I've waited 70 years for the truth. I'm not sitting in the truck." They walked up the path together. Elliot knocked. Once. Twice. A long pause. Then the door creaked open. A man in his late 80s stared at them through a cracked screen. His eyes were pale and sunken, but alert. He wore a flannel shirt, suspenders, and had a cane propped against the doorframe. "Martin Elwell?" Elliot asked. "Depends who's asking." "My name's Elliot Granger. This is Clara Banks. We're looking for information about the Benton family." Elwell didn't blink, but something in his jaw tightened. "Not a name I've heard in a long time," he said. Elliot held up the ledger. "You were listed in this, with Vernon Croft." Elwell's eyes dropped to the book, and for just a second, the mask slipped. "I don't want trouble," he muttered, stepping back. "We're not here for trouble," Clara said, stepping forward. "We're here for the truth. My father's name was James Benton. He worked for Croft. He died trying to protect me and my mother. And I think you know why." Elwell stood frozen in the doorway. Then he let out a breath and stepped aside. Inside, the house smelled of old tobacco and dust. A wall of faded newspaper clippings lined one corner of the living room, stories of mining accidents, political changes, company mergers. Elwell lowered himself into a creaking chair and motioned for them to sit. "I was young back then," he said. 23. Hired muscle mostly. I ran logistics, kept things off the books." "For Croft?" Elliot asked. "For the entire damn county," Elwell snapped. "But yeah, Croft paid the best." "What happened to my father?" Clara asked quietly. Elwell stared at the floor. He found something he wasn't supposed to. Safety violations, falsified inspection reports. Croft was cutting corners to increase output, knew the mine was unstable but kept pushing. And when James tried to speak up, Elliot prompted. Elwell hesitated. Then they made it look like an accident. The fire at the Benton house, the mine explosion, it was all orchestrated. Croft wanted James silenced, said he was getting idealistic. Clara's hands clenched. "And you helped Elwell didn't look up. I didn't kill anyone, but I didn't stop it either. And I knew. I knew what it meant when I saw that house burn." "Did you know he survived the mine?" Elliot asked. Elwell's eyes widened. "No. He made it out. Made it to the shelter. Left a notebook, warnings, everything." Elwell closed his eyes. "Then that man had more courage than any of us. We thought he was gone." "You were wrong," Clara said, her voice shaking. "And I think you still know something you're not saying." Elwell sat in silence for a long beat. Then he stood, limped to a cabinet, and pulled out a faded manila envelope. He handed it to Elliot. "This was supposed to be destroyed, but I kept it. Guilt, I guess." Inside were original inspection logs signed by Croft himself, confirming that the mine was unstable prior to the explosion. There was even a memo, "Keep operations quiet. Benton is not a concern anymore." Elliot's stomach turned. "This proves it," he said. Clara looked up. We can bring this to the paper. Elwell shook his head. They won't print it. Croft still funds half the city's charities. But someone will listen. Someone has to. Elliot pocketed the envelope. We'll find them. As they left, Clara paused on the porch. You lived with that secret all these years, she said. Doesn't it eat at you? Elwell didn't meet her eyes. Every night. Back in the truck, Elliot handed Clara the envelope. She held it like something sacred. They'll try to bury this too, she said. Not if we don't let them. Elliot and Clara prepare to go public, but as they begin contacting local journalists, they realize someone else is watching. The past isn't done fighting, and the truth has enemies who still know how to keep things quiet. Permanently. The deeper you dig, the louder they get, and not all ghosts want to be found. The manila envelope lay in the center of the motel room table like it carried weight far beyond its paper contents. Elliot stared at it as Clara sat on the edge of the bed, her shoulders tense, hands clasped. The curtains were drawn. The morning sun filtered through the gaps in vertical slits, throwing hard shadows across their faces. Elliot had made 3 calls already. 2 to independent journalists and Knoxville people he'd worked with once on environmental stories years ago. The 3rd call was to someone from out of state, someone who owed him a favor. So far, only one had called back. Her name was Tess Alvarez, a former investigative reporter turned freelancer. Tough, relentless, and more importantly, unaffiliated with any Croft-funded media outlet. She agreed to meet them that afternoon at a diner on the outskirts of the city. Neutral ground. Cameras left at home. I want to believe this will make a difference, Clara said, staring out the window. But I keep thinking, if my father couldn't stop them, what chance do we have now? Elliot looked at her. You've already done what they never expected survived. Spoke. That's power they can't erase. He meant it, but even as he said the words, his gut turned. Because someone had followed them last night. He was sure of it. After leaving Elwell's, he'd noticed the same SUV trailing them through 2 turns. Then again at the gas station. This morning, a man was parked in the lot across the street pretending to read a paper in a car with out-of-state plates. Not Croft. Too old, too insulated to get his hands dirty. But someone else was watching. They didn't talk about it aloud, but Clara saw it too. She didn't have to say anything. The quiet way she kept checking the lock. The extra glance at their side mirror. The shift in her breathing when the motel ice machine roared unexpectedly. The past wasn't just creeping back. It was accelerating. The diner was half empty when they arrived. Vinyl booths, Formica tables, the kind of place where conversations were meant to disappear into the hiss of fryers and the clink of cheap ceramic mugs. Tess sat in the back, dark hair tied up, a notepad and recorder in front of her, though neither were turned on yet. She stood to shake their hands, eyes sharp but kind. This better be as good as you said, she said to Elliot with a small smirk. I canceled a profile on a state senator for this. It's better, Elliot replied. It's buried murder, corporate corruption, and a cover-up that's lasted 70 years. Clara slid the envelope across the table. Tess opened it slowly, scanning the contents with a speed that suggested she'd done this too many times before. Her eyes stopped at the inspection memo. Her posture changed. You've got Croft's signature on a falsified safety report. That's the kind of thing people get sued for now, she said. But back then, that could have disappeared forever. It almost did, Clara said softly. And so did we. Tess looked at her, really looked for the first time. You're the daughter, Clara nodded. I used to be Clara Benton. My father died trying to protect us. They burned our home, buried our name. And now, I just want people to know he wasn't a ghost. Tess closed the file. This is explosive, but it's also dangerous. You know that, right? You put this out, it won't just disappear into a blog. People still owe Croft favors. Some still cash his checks. Elliot leaned in. That's why we're giving it to you. You've got reach. You know how to build a story they can't ignore. Tess hesitated. You sure you want this public? Clara nodded. I lived in silence too long. If I keep it inside now, I'm no better than the people who let it happen. Tess studied her for a moment longer, then reached for her phone. I'll scan and encrypt these tonight. I have sources at the Tribune ones who don't flinch easy. Give me 48 hours. They agreed. Then just as Tess reached for her coffee, her eyes narrowed. Don't look, but the guy behind you just snapped a photo. Third time since you sat down. Elliot's spine stiffened. He rose casually and walked to the counter, passing the booth in question. The man, mid-40s, clean-cut, too stiff to be local, was pretending to scroll through his phone. But the camera app was still open in the bottom corner. Elliot didn't say a word. He just locked eyes with the man long enough to send a message, "We see you." The man stood and left seconds later. Back at the table, Tess was already collecting her things. Congratulations, she said. You've rattled someone. That means you're over the right target. As they exited, Clara touched Elliot's arm. You think that was Croft's man? Doesn't matter, Elliot said. It means they know we're not afraid anymore. That's what scares them. Back at the motel, Elliot double-checked the windows, the locks, the alley behind the building. Nothing immediate. But the edge was there now. A hum in the air. Something in motion. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She sat in the plastic lawn chair outside their room, wrapped in a blanket, staring up at the stars, as if waiting for them to rearrange into answers. Elliot joined her around 3 a.m., handing her a coffee. I keep thinking, she said softly, what if this makes it worse? It won't. You don't know that. No, Elliot admitted. But I know what silence did to your family. This is the only way forward. She sipped the coffee, then said, almost like a thought drifting free, the deeper you dig, the louder they get, and not all ghosts want to be found. He didn't disagree, but he also knew this ghost wanted to speak. At sunrise, Elliot's phone rang. It was Tess. We've got a problem, she said without preamble. The Tribune passed. Said they didn't have room in the current news cycle. But my source told me the story scared someone big. Croft's lawyers reached out less than an hour after I scanned the documents. They're trying to shut it down, Elliot said. Worse, they want it buried again, and if you keep pushing, they'll come harder. Elliot looked at Clara, already knowing what she would say. Then we go louder, he said. Careful, Tess warned. That only works if you don't get silenced first. Elliot and Clara doubled down, preparing to release the story publicly through independent channels. But their push draws blood, a break-in missing evidence, and a message delivered with force, stop digging, or someone else won't make it out. You think the truth sets you free until it knocks the wind out of you. The motel door was ajar when Elliot and Clara returned from breakfast. It wasn't wide open, just a 2-inch gap. Enough for the latch to hang useless. Enough for Elliot to stop short on the sidewalk, his hand automatically moving to the pocket where he kept his folding knife. Clara, sensing the shift in his body, froze behind him. Stay here, he whispered. Elliot nudged the door open with his foot. The room was silent. Too silent. He stepped inside, eyes scanning drawers open. Pillows slashed. Mattress flipped. The television cracked along the corner like someone had kicked it. The manila envelope they'd hidden it under the floorboard behind the dresser was gone. Clara entered behind him and gasped when she saw the chaos. "It's gone," Elliot said, voice low and tight. "No." She moved to the dresser, pulling it aside. The loose panel was still there, but the compartment was empty. "They knew exactly where to look," he said. Clara turned to him, trembling. "They were watching us." "Still are," Elliot said. "This wasn't a warning. It was a reset. They don't want us dead. They want us doubtful." She shook her head. How could they have found the hiding spot? Tess, Elliot offered, then quickly dismissed it. No, she wouldn't betray this, but someone might have been tapping her cloud storage. Croft's people have the money and tech to do it. "And now we have nothing," Clara said. Her voice cracked, but not from panic, from grief. "No files, no proof. Just our word against his." Elliot didn't argue. The pain in her voice echoed everything he feared. "You think the truth sets you free until it knocks the wind out of you," she said, sinking onto the corner of the bed. "I thought we were close." Elliot sat beside her. "We are. They just threw their best punch. That means we hit a nerve. They're scared, Clara, and we're vulnerable. For now." He stood pacing his mind, moving faster than his steps. "They wouldn't destroy the documents," he muttered. "Not immediately. If Croft's people intercepted the scans, they'll keep a copy to control the narrative if they ever need to spin it. Maybe even to blackmail someone. Croft's legacy is an empire, and empires archive everything. You're saying they stored it somewhere. I'm saying there's a digital vault. We just need access." Clara looked up. "How Tess has contacts. If we can get to someone on the inside of Croft Holdings or someone who's been there, we might have a shot." Elliot pulled out his phone. Miraculously, Tess picked up on the first ring. "I know," she said before he even spoke. "I heard. You're not the first call." "What do you mean?" "Someone broke into my apartment last night. They wiped my external drives. My notebooks are still here, but I don't know for how long. They're trying to erase this story before it breathes." "We need a back door," Elliot said. "Croft's servers, internal logs, someone who's handled his legacy files." Tess paused. "There might be someone. I'm listening. Retired IT specialist. Name's Wade McClellan. Used to be Croft's chief of digital records before they moved everything offshore. He lives alone up in Roane County now. Paranoid as hell, but if anyone has a copy or knows where they keep one, it's him. Can you get us in? I'll text you the address. But be careful if they're watching you. They might be watching him too." Elliot ended the call and turned to Clara. "We drive now." Roane County sat like a forgotten limb of Tennessee, carved into the woods and mountains with long roads that never seemed to end. Wade McClellan's house was buried down a gravel path marked by nothing but a rusted mailbox. No neighbors, no signage, just trees and birdsong and the sense that time had slowed here. They parked 50 yards from the house and walked the rest on foot, cautious. The door was barred from the inside. Elliot knocked twice. A voice barked, "Who sent you, Tess?" "Alvarez," Elliot called back. Silence. Then the sound of locks unlatching. The door creaked open to reveal a wiry man in his 60s wearing sweatpants, a tank top, and a suspicious scowl. His left eye twitched. "You got 5 minutes," he said. "Say something stupid, and I feed your tires to the dogs." Clara stepped forward. "We're not here for trouble. We're here for answers." Wade grunted and stepped aside. The inside of the house was equal parts hoarder den and command center. Old hard drives stacked like bricks, monitors with lines of code scrolling, a corkboard with photos, maps, even a few newspaper clippings crossed again and again. I knew someone would come, Wade said, lowering himself into a creaky desk chair. Man like Croft doesn't leave without loose ends. You worked for him, Elliot asked. Worked is generous. I digitized decades of dirt, then got pushed out when they upgraded security. But not before I took insurance. Clara leaned in. What kind of insurance? Wade reached under his desk and pulled out a metal briefcase. He clicked it open and revealed a slim, sealed USB drive. Encrypted. Redundant. If anything happened to me, it was set to auto-send to 3 media outlets. Problem is, they're all on Croft's payroll now. Elliot extended his hand. We'll take it. Wade hesitated. If I hand this over, I disappear. You get that right? We'll protect you, Clara said. Wade laughed bitterly. Lady, no one gets protected in stories like this. But maybe someone gets remembered. He passed the drive to Elliot. And then the window shattered. A single shot. Silenced. Wade fell backward, blood spreading from his chest, before he even hit the ground. Down, Elliot yelled, dragging Clara to the floor. 2 more shots cracked the drywall. Elliot reached into Wade's desk, found a flare gun of all things, and fired it blindly through the window. The blaze of red streaked across the sky, and somewhere in the distance, tires squealed. By the time they rushed outside, whoever had fired was gone. But the drive was still in Elliot's hand. Clara stared at Wade's lifeless body. He gave everything to keep it alive. Elliot nodded grimly. So now we finish it. With the encrypted drive in hand and 1 more life lost, Elliot and Clara flee Knoxville and head for a safe location to upload the files and release the truth. But Croft's people are closing in fast, and they'll only get 1 chance to set the record straight before they're silenced for good. Justice doesn't wait for the perfect moment. It breaks through when someone's brave enough to open the door. The rain hadn't let up since they hit the road. Sheets of it washed over the windshield, making the 2-lane highway outside Nashville look more like a river than a road. Elliot gripped the steering wheel tighter, knuckles, pale eyes scanning the rearview mirror every few seconds. So far, they weren't being followed. But that didn't mean they weren't being watched. Clara sat beside him, the USB drive clutched tightly in her hand like it was sacred. Wade McClellan's blood was still on its casing. She hadn't let go of it since they fled. His cabin hadn't said much either. Her face was calm, but her silence held weight. They were headed to a secure location Elliot had used before, a rural journalism safe house run by an old friend, Marcus Trent, a cybersecurity expert who used to work for whistleblowers and human rights reporters. It wasn't flashy. No signals, no IDs, just a satellite connection, a bunker-style basement, and a broadcast server that could stream to thousands without being traced. It was their best and maybe only chance. When they finally pulled off the main road deep into the backwoods of Tennessee, the trees closed in like guards at a gate. The cabin came into view, stone foundation, steel door, no windows facing the road. A soft light glowed from within. Marcus was already waiting. Elliot parked, stepped out into the rain, and waved toward the cabin. The door opened. Marcus stepped out, broad-shouldered, sharp-eyed, graying at the temples. He nodded once, solemn. "No time to waste," he said. "You brought it." Clara held up the drive. They moved fast. Inside, the walls were lined with acoustic panels and server racks. A desk covered in monitors sat like a command post. Marcus led them down a narrow stairwell to the basement where the air grew colder, heavier, more still. "This room's off-grid. No signal leaks. Not even GPS can trace it," Marcus said. "Whatever's on that drive, It's going to breathe before anyone can choke it. Clara handed him the USB. Her voice was calm but resolute. This isn't just data. It's a ledger of silence. Every entry costs someone something. Marcus nodded. Let's make it cost them something back. He inserted the drive. Password protection. Triple encryption. The interface hissed to life with a series of timestamps, file logs, and folder names. Elliot leaned in. Can you crack it? Marcus smirked. Watch me. He typed fast, breaking through the first layer within minutes. The second took longer. They waited in near silence as the system churned. Rain pounded the tin roof above like war drums. When the third layer finally fell, a string of folders opened like trapdoors. Here we go, Marcus muttered. Inspection reports, internal memos, signed orders, scans of original ledgers. Everything your friend Wade said was here and more. Anything on the mind? Clara asked. Marcus opened a folder titled Benton Ops. Inside, a damning trove. One memo was a direct directive from Croft to forge signatures on safety approvals. Another listed bribes paid to local officials. There were even handwritten notes from Croft referencing the girl and the mother and stating, "Ensure their isolation is permanent use fire if necessary." Clara covered her mouth. That's the order, Elliot whispered. That's the moment the story went from greed to murder. Marcus backed everything up across 4 hidden servers. Then he asked, "How do you want to go public?" Elliot turned to Clara. She stood tall even in that dim, cold room. Not anonymously. They erased our names once. Not again. Elliot nodded. We'll include a personal statement. Tie it to the story. Human faces. Real stakes. Marcus began drafting the public data drop. The files would go live to encrypted journalism outlets, government watchdogs, and international human rights organizations. Then they'd flood social platforms with a timed release. Once it hits, it can't be stopped, Marcus said. But you'll both be targets. We already are, Clara replied. Before they could activate the upload, Marcus's console flashed red. Ping, he muttered. That's not right. What is it? Elliot asked. Someone's probing the network. Outside perimeter. Passive scan, smart quiet, but definitely not random. Someone knows you're here. Elliot's adrenaline surged. How much time? Minutes. Maybe less. Clara didn't flinch. Do it. Now. Marcus hit the final key. The upload bar lit up. A progress window opened slow but steady. Outside, the sound of tires on gravel sliced through the storm. Almost there, Marcus muttered. Then a gunshot cracked through the trees. Glass shattered upstairs. They found us, Elliot shouted, pulling Clara down as Marcus slammed a reinforced steel shutter across the stairwell entrance. Basement's sealed, Marcus said. They'll have to cut through concrete. Another gunshot, a thud against the cabin walls. Uploads at 82%, Marcus growled. Come on, Clara looked at Elliot, breath ragged. We're not leaving until it finishes, I know. 93%. A third shot. Sparks flew from one of the server racks. Marcus cursed and yanked a cable. Rerouting power. If they cut the line, we've still got juice for 30 seconds. 98%. Outside footsteps pounded the porch. Then 100%. The screen blinked. Upload complete. Public sync initiated. Marcus let out a breath and smiled for the first time all day. It's out. They can't stop it now, Clara asked. Not unless they kill the entire internet. Upstairs, the cabin door gave way with a crash. Boots thundered across the floor. Elliot turned to Marcus. Is there a back exit? He nodded. Storm hatch. Come on! They grabbed the external backup drive, tore through the back tunnel, and emerged into the woods behind the cabin. Rain masked their tracks, the thunder their footsteps. In the distance, headlights flickered between trees, but they were already gone, swallowed by the forest. By dawn, the story was everywhere. Major news outlets picked it up. Whistleblower sites verified it. Politicians issued statements. Former Croft partners scrambled for cover. And most damning of all, Vernon Croft himself was named in 3 federal investigations before noon. Clara sat in a borrowed car on a dirt road just outside a quiet town, watching the story break in real time on a burner phone. She turned to Elliot, voice quiet but firm. Justice doesn't wait for the perfect moment, it breaks through when someone's brave enough to open the door. He nodded. And you kicked it open. As Croft's empire begins to crumble, Clara faces a tidal wave of public attention. But one loose end remains, a sealed court document buried in a Tennessee archive that holds the final key to the shelter's true origin and a decision that could change everything. I thought exposing the truth would be the hardest part, but the hardest part is deciding what to do with it. The storm had passed, but Clara felt no calm. The public reckoning had begun. News outlets devoured the Croft story talk shows, invited survivors and whistleblowers to speak, and within 72 hours, Vernon Croft had become a household name for all the wrong reasons. His empire was unraveling. But something still felt unfinished. Clara sat in the library of the Monroe County Courthouse, tucked into a corner beside a dusty radiator, flipping through yellowed legal filings. Elliot sat across from her, working through a parallel stack. He had offered to go alone, but Clara insisted on being here. The farther they traveled into Croft's past, the more she realized how deeply it was tied to hers. The folder in front of her was labeled Benton Vietzus Croft Mining Co., sealed 1955. It's here, she whispered, tapping the cover. Elliot looked up. Are you sure? She nodded. Filed 2 years after the explosion. Suppressed by Croft's legal team. It never saw a courtroom. Elliot reached for it, gently flipping open the first page. A lawsuit filed by Nora Benton, her mother. The words hit Clara like a punch to the chest. She sued him. She tried, Clara murmured, and he buried it. The documents detailed claims of negligence, unlawful retaliation, property destruction, and the wrongful death of James Benton. But that wasn't the only surprise. Attached was a letter, handwritten, dated February 4th, 1955. It wasn't addressed to the court. It was addressed to Clara. Elliot read aloud, "To my daughter, in case the law fails." Clara took it from his hands, her fingers trembling. The letter was long, but the tone was unmistakable, her mother's voice weary but defiant. I tried to fight. They told me to be quiet, that he was gone, that I imagined the escape. But I know James survived. I heard his voice. I felt his arms around me that night before they came. They took everything. But I kept this, his notebook, his words, and you. If you ever find this, remember, the truth is yours now. I couldn't carry it. But maybe you can. Clara blinked away tears. She knew. She always knew, she whispered. Elliot leaned back, exhaling. Your mother risked everything to bring Croft down, even after losing your father. She didn't give up. They just silenced her. Clara nodded slowly, holding the letter to her chest. And now the silence ends with me. They dug deeper through the sealed file. Buried in the appendix was a permit one Clara had never seen before. Authorization for subterranean expansion, 1949. Signed not by Croft, but by a state official, Charles H. Duvall. Elliot's brow furrowed. Wait a minute. Duvall. That name's come up before. Clara's memory clicked. Wasn't he the commissioner who shut down Hollow Ridge? Yes. But according to this, he approved an expansion before the shutdown. That means Croft operated the shelter illegally for years, and Duvall helped cover it. Elliot scanned the details. This isn't just negligence, it's conspiracy. The state was complicit, which explains why every attempt to expose Croft died on the vine. Clara's eyes narrowed. Is there any record of what that expansion was for Elliot? Pulled a smaller form from the back of the file. Shelter installation, emergency continuity, Site B, purpose containment, not evacuation. He froze. This wasn't just a survival shelter. It was a vault, a prison. Clara stared at him. For who? Elliot shook his head. Or for what? The coordinates listed pointed back to Hollow Ridge, which meant the hidden chamber they discovered, the one with the journal, the symbols carved into the walls, the sealed steel door Elliot hadn't opened, was never meant for rescue. It was meant to contain something Croft didn't want released. Clara stood, her hands tightening into fists. Then we need to go back. Clara, wait. I'm not running anymore. Not from him. Not from what's underneath that mountain. There's more to this story, Elliot. I can feel it. Elliot didn't argue. He understood. She wasn't chasing ghosts. She was chasing closure. That night they returned to Hollow Ridge under cover of dark. Hank bounded ahead, the beam of their flashlight swinging through the trees like a lighthouse beam lost in fog. The storm damage had changed the trail, but Clara remembered every bend, every gnarled root. When they reached the entrance to the hidden shelter, Elliot paused. Are you sure? He asked. Clara answered by pushing open the rotted wooden door. The air inside was cold and stale, a tomb untouched. They moved carefully down the steps. The journal was still there. The marks on the wall, the day, counts, the old metal cot, it all remained frozen in time. But Clara didn't stop this time. She walked past the cot to the far wall, the one with the steel panel. Last time they hadn't opened it. This time she was ready. Elliot ran his hands along the edge, then spotted it, a recessed handle. He yanked hard. Rusted bolts groaned and the door creaked open an inch, then more. Behind it, another chamber, smaller, unlit, but filled with shelves, crates, and a row of documents in glass cases. Holy hell, Elliot whispered. Clara stepped inside. She reached for the nearest case. Inside was a thick file labeled Project Dyke Psychological Protocols for Civil Control. Elliot scanned the titles. MK Variant Conditioning, Containment Ethics, Pre-Evacuation Compliance Tests. What was this place? Clara answered quietly. Not a shelter, a lab. They found tapes, old ones, recordings of interviews, subjects who had been brought in for experiments in moral resistance under isolation. Dates ran from 1951 to 1953, then stopped abruptly. This was Croft's real project, Elliot said. Not mining, not expansion, control. He was testing what people would do when the world collapsed, how to bend them, break them. Clara held up a photo. Her father, James Benton, standing next to Croft, not in chains, not in defiance, smiling. A chill ran through her. Why is he smiling? She whispered. Elliot didn't answer. Because whatever came next, whatever truth still lived in these tapes and files, it might not be as clean as they hoped. Clara sat down in the center of the room, surrounded by the records of broken people, broken trust. I thought exposing the truth would be the hardest part, she said. But the hardest part is deciding what to do with it. Elliot lowered himself beside her. You don't have to carry it alone. She nodded, but her eyes didn't leave the photo. Because her father's smile wasn't one of peace. It was a smile of someone who had chosen silence. Clara and Elliot must confront the final revelations about James Benton's role inside the shelter. As the line between victim and accomplice blurs, Clara faces a final choice: bury the remaining secrets, or reveal them all and let the world decide what justice really looks like. The tapes were brittle from age, their labels faded to near invisibility. Elliot handled them like glass, setting each reel onto the dusty recorder in the corner of the chamber. Clara sat nearby, her knees drawn to her chest, arms wrapped around them, like she was trying to hold herself together while the final pieces of her life fell into place. The first tape hissed to life. Interview 017, James Benton, March 3, 1952. The voice that spoke wasn't Croft's. It was clinical, impersonal. Subject has exhibited signs of psychological resilience under isolation. Today's focus, moral compromise and induced loyalty. There was a pause. Then her father's voice. You keep asking what I'll do to protect them. The answer's the same. It's everything. Anything. Clara closed her eyes, his voice wrapping around her like a ghost and a hug all at once. But it wasn't just grief. There was something underneath his words, a tremor, an edge. The tape continued. And if we asked you to prove it, you'd be asking me to lose what makes me human. That's not a no, Mr. Benton. Another pause. A silence so loud it echoed. Then James Benton said,